Well, it's time for the Sports Ambassador Report Card on Paris 2024. The cauldron has been extinguished, all the activity of the past 17 days has been concluded, and the city will now take a short break before preparing for the Paralympic Games. The three experts I've got together today are people whose opinions and analysis I really value because they're experts in their field, and they don't come from an agenda-driven position. They come from a desire to actually observe, document and analyse history as it's being made. Now, what we've seen here in the past 2 and a bit weeks has been nothing short of phenomenal, and of course not without its challenges. But 128 years after the founding of the first modern Olympic Games, we have seen Paris show us that it's not only possible to adapt to change and still be true to yourself, but it's an absolute necessity. My first guest is Chip Legrand. He is the chief reporter. He covers national affairs, crime and sport for The Age and 9 newspapers. Well, welcome to Cafe Bonaparte, where we're going to sort of dissect the Paris Olympic Games a little with Chip Legrand, well-known Australian journalist and someone whose views and writings and musings have always intrigued me, and I respect you greatly, which is why I've asked you to be part of this podcast, Chip. Just overall, what have been your impressions of these games? First of all, how many have you done?
So this is my third. So I was lucky enough to be there with at Sydney, fairly young journalist at the time, and then Tokyo, which obviously was a very unusual games for all sorts of reasons, and now Paris, and really. I mean, there's a few strong impressions about Paris. I think, especially given where we came with Tokyo and even Rio before that, which had so many sort of organisational problems. There's just been an openness and really a sort of a joy in Paris. I do think they put the fun back in the games, and they needed to. It's been a really sort of noticeable thing about just the whole sort of atmosphere around the venues. Around the city, and the other sort of standout thing about these games has been really the venues have been absolutely spectacular. Of course, everyone's seen the pictures. I mean, it's probably the most Instagrammable games, hasn't it? You've got with the Eiffel Tower and the beach volleyball, but things like say the Grand Palais for the fencing. The Hotel des Invalides for the archery. It's just been a terrific backdrop, and I reckon that the really interesting thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in terms of looking forward to what it might mean for Brisbane and what Brisbane might take out of this for 2032. They've started to almost deconstruct the games in a way that they've decided, okay, you don't have to, when you're putting on a sport event, not everything has to be in a big concrete stadium. You can pretty much put sport on anywhere, right? So it's really the only limitations are your own creativity and how you can kind of conceive of where sport might be played. And I reckon the thing about Paris, now we're not, obviously Brisbane's not going to do what Paris has done, they don't have an Eiffel Tower, but there are some extraordinary features of southeast Queensland, and I think the challenge is, okay, where do we want to put on sport in a way that kind of brings the games to our people, shows off the region, shows off Brisbane, and gives it that real a sense of kind of local flair.
Yeah. My second guest is Lindsay Krasnoff, someone who spends a lot of time here in France, although she's not based here permanently. She's the author of Basketball Empire, France and the Making of the Global NBA and WNBA. She also lectures in sport and diplomacy at New York University.
So there's kind of three main threads that I've been following through these games. One is how hosting and the manner in which France has hosted these games is going to be somewhat successful in finally pushing the needle forward in inscribing sport as a full and valuable part of French culture, even though French athletes and sports people have led the shaping of our international sports world from Pierre de Coubertin and Jules Rimet to Alice Milliat and much more present day examples, sport has long not been viewed as a equal or integral part of French culture, not looked upon as highly as gastronomy, the high arts, poetry, haute couture, and so forth. So, what I've been trying to assess is, has this entire hosting and endeavor, is that finally moving the needle? Like, we can come back and unpack that a little bit more. The second thing I've been looking at is, particularly after a very acrimonious and divisive snap legislative elections in France, which really mainstreamed even more a lot of the anti-isms that have fractured French society, anti-immigrant, xenophobia, anti-Semitic, how coming together and cheering for French athletes of all different hues, stripes, and backgrounds, obviously that can't wash away the real divisions that exist, but has it, helped to heal a little bit some of that initial rancor from the snap elections? And three, I've been following the role of basketball, not just basketball diplomacy, but how the world has gotten better. And, we're seeing that play out in the 5x5 men's and women's Olympic tournaments. We saw that in the 3x3 competitions, as the United States in the 5x5s has really been pushed to the test. The men still won gold yesterday, but the French pushed them all the way to the very last minutes.
Regular subscribers to the Sports Ambassador podcast will be familiar with my third analyst today, Dr. Yoav Dubinsky from the University of Oregon, where he lectures in sports business. Now, he's also the author of Nation Branding and Sports Diplomacy, Country Image Games in Times of Change. Coming into these games, there were so many flashpoints that really could have erupted with that geopolitical lens: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, the China doping scenario that the US is constantly, fanning the flames of. There's a lot of stuff going on in that regard, and it kind of didn't really get very far, maybe because it was overtaken by another issue completely, which was still very much a Russia issue, with the International Boxing Association and questions over the gender of two boxers who went on to win gold medals.
I agree with that. I believe that we that we've both been to the first press conference and seen how many questions were about Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Gaza, and overall geopolitics and political neutrality and these questions. And during the games, I'm not going to say that athletes did not feel that, or that there were no protests anywhere in Paris. But as I was born in Tel Aviv, where I've been to quite a few of Israel's participation and in Israeli competitions, the in-stadium manifestations were very minor. The biggest ones was 2 days before the opening ceremony that I've attended, was 2 days before the opening ceremony in a football game between Israel and Mali. But since the opening ceremony, and I've been to judo, to gymnastics, to quite a lot, I have not seen in-stadium protests. So I agree that was relatively minor in comparison to the amount of questions and concerns prior to that. Now, we were talking before the closing ceremony, and until it's over, it's not, and there's the Paralympic, of course. But I agree that in comparison to the hype and potential escalation, we did not see that through the games. What we did see, and I agree with that, is more of internal organizational bureaucracies between sports organizations, whether that's the USOPC and USADA against the IOC and WADA about the Chinese doping and who has the authority about doping and how that manifests in the bid for Salt Lake City, the clashes between the International Boxing Federation and the IOC about who has control of regulation and how that manifests through gender. I also think that there's some aspect of sensationalism and populism in terms of how things are covered, but I definitely agree that governmental geopolitics was secondary to organizational, political power struggles here.
What you've heard is just a snapshot of what my guests have had to say. If you want to hear their interviews in full, please head to Patreon and check out the Sports Ambassador podcast page. It's on that podcast that you'll hear them in full. Now, next time, I'm going to take a look at the leadership of the International Olympic Committee, because the 9th president of the IOC, Thomas Bach, has confirmed he will step down next year. That means lobbying has already begun to find his successor. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'm Tracy Holmes from the Sports Ambassador. See you next time.